bunch of different oppressions. And when we talk about oppression at ICA, we're usually talking about anything that ends in ISN, right? So an ism, right? Somebody list off a couple of isms that you guys know about. Organism, right? We're thinking about oppression. What are different oppressions that you know about that end in the term ism? If you're thinking about, let's give the example of white people versus people of color. What's an ism that we might associate with that system that we'll talk about in just a second here? So racism. Somebody read me the definition or speak it in your own words. What's the definition of racism? Or just you guys put the paper down for a second. You know what racism is. What is it? What is it?
One color has more power than others.
What color specifically has more power? Yeah. So when we're looking at white people being the privileged group over at the expense of folks of color, we're talking about racism, right? When we're looking at the privilege that wealthy people have over poor folks, what ism might we be thinking about then? You can cheat by looking at your sheet here. What's that? White supremacy, that's connected, but we'll get to that later. Connected, but we'll get to that later. That's a system. Classism, totally, right? So classism is the ism that we think about when we think about the differences between classes. So working class folks, upper class folks, middle class folks, and where they fall on the spectrum. Right? Make sense? Okay, so we've got classism, we've got racism. What is the oppression we think about when we think about the privilege men have over women? Sexism. You guys are really getting it now. That's awesome. So sexism there. How about, this one is a little, we're less familiar with this term, I think, but how about the oppression that adults take over young people? Adultism is the ism that we're talking about here. So that's when adults exercise power and privilege over young people. Okay, we're talking about adultism. When able-bodied people exercise power and privilege over folks with disabilities, we're talking about ableism there. Heterosexual folks versus LGBTQ folks. Homophobia is a fear. Yeah, that's the ism. Totally. So homophobia is a part of heterosexism, but heterosexism is the larger form of oppression that takes. Run the list really quickly. So U.S. citizens versus immigrants. What ism might we talk about here? Patriotism is a good term for it, or we can also talk about racism when we talk about the tension between immigrants and non-immigrants. Yeah? Y'all were doing a really good job of connecting the systems already. You were asking if some of these related to systems. Somebody read for me the definition of imperialism. We're going to start from really, really big and work our way down to smaller. Somebody read the definition of imperialism on that.
The international system that gives power and privilege to the nation with the most control of the global economy, mostly the USA, at the expense of nations with less money and international control.
Cool. And imperialism refers to like the larger way that developed countries exploit and use developing countries, right? So countries with more access to resources and money, the way that they exploit countries with less of that stuff. Here we're talking specifically about America and the ways that America does that with other countries, okay? So that plays into like our immigration policy, it plays into the way that we do trade with other countries, all kinds of stuff, okay? Someone read to me the definition of capitalism on your sheet.
An economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit.
Now let's read patriarchy. What's the definition of patriarchy on that sheet?
A political social system that insists that males are by nature superior to everything and everyone being weak, especially females, endowed with the right to dominate and rule.
So the important phrase there, you guys, is the political and social system, right? And you can put that in front of any of these definitions. So the way that these systems are different than the forms of oppression is they're like all-encompassing, right? So they're political and social systems that include institutions, individuals, everything to keep oppression in place. Does that make sense? So patriarchy, the system that we live in the United States, keeps sexism in place. Is that clear, you guys? So capitalism, for example, what form of oppression on this list right here might capitalism really closely keep in place?
Fascism.
Yes, why?
because they're using these big private owners to keep these smaller people down in there.
To keep some people really rich and a lot of people really poor, right? Patriarchy, what else, what other form of oppression might patriarchy keep intact? Sexism, so we heard that one for sure. What else? This one might be a little bit of a stickier connection.
Racism?
Racism, tell me about that.
I don't know, I was just taking a guess. See if you explain it to me.
You're a smart guy. Actually, let's move to our last system then, because I think this one really clearly relates to racism, which is white supremacy.
I was just going to say that.
Yeah, could you read that for me then?
The system that enables white dominant people of color by controlling the economic, political, educational, and social life of society. This is often done through the use of violence. Coercion.
So like trying to convince someone to do something.
And surveillance.
Totally. So again, that white supremacy is this larger thing that pervades like all forms of society, right? So our institutions, our individuals, and our like interpersonal connections between people, and that keeps racism intact. Is that clear, you guys? So if we're moving down the line, right, and this is like power and oppression 101, right? We got to think systems. So all of the systems that we live in. In America, we live in a patriarchal, white supremacist, imperialistic capitalism, right? Those are the systems that we live in America. At least those are the assumptions that ICA makes about the systems that we live in America, right? And that those systems keep all these different forms of oppression intact, right? So keep classism, racism, adultism, ableism, all those isms in place. Is that clear?
Yeah.
So then that keeps these folks having privilege over these folks. So if we want to start to break down the privilege that certain folks have over others, like if we don't like that white people have privilege over folks of color and we want to have equal access to all kinds of stuff, we have to not only look at the ways that we can do that in our personal lives and between individuals, but also the ways that we can change and transform institutions and systems. Does that make sense?